Now let's talk about the weekend. Let's talk about that fight. Let's talk about Tyson Fury and where he stands in history when it comes to the heavyweights, because he said some things that could raise an eyebrow, but that could cause debate, that could many would agree or disagree with. Where would you place him in and amongst the history of the heavyweights? I have my opinion of it, and I think that he has proved. Excuse my French. He uses the phrase "shithouse." He's proved he's not a shithouse. He can back up his boast. He's done everything asked of him. He's beaten everybody that's out there in front of him. He cannot just fight. He can box. So when he says, "I'm a fighting man," you understand it. The translation of that is he can fight no matter what you put in front of him. He's shown that he can fight messy. He can fight tidy. He can box messy. He can box tidy. He can box southpaw orthodox. He's proved all that. So I think now, even though there may have been a question of him, now he's got to have credit where credit's due, because this guy is not just a fighter, he was a talker as well and a singer. You've got to give credit where credit's due. And I'm quite sure Ali, and I'm not saying he's an Ali, but I'm quite sure Ali, because of his loud mouth, because of his loose tongue, his loose lips, maybe it did rub people the wrong way. But eventually, people had to just give credit where credit was due. Would you agree? Where would you put him?
Well, I agree that, he does back up what he says. I mean, he wins. And the remarkable thing to me about Tyson Fury is not that, we viewed him initially as a boxer and not a great puncher. But the last 3 fights now, he's knocked out Deontay Wilder twice, and he's knocked out White. So he can punch. But what is remarkable to me more than all of that is the agility he has, the size that he has. It's a giant, a 265-pound, 6'9" guy who moves not the same speed as an Ali, but certainly with the agility for that size. And in the past, when we had these giant heavyweights, starting with Jess Willard and then Carnera, and probably reaching the maximum with Valuev, that 7'3" Russian giant who won a version of the title, he puts them to shame. I mean, they had nowhere near his agility. He's really remarkable for that. So he has the power, he has the ability to take a punch, and he has the ability to box well and move in the ring. So it's pretty phenomenal, his physical attributes.
What would you place him? Because right now, in this era, with the competition that's around, you've got to put him up there as top dog in this era with what's around. But then you could go back further. You'd look at, okay, let's go back. Right. And so before him, an established one, you'd look at Lennox Lewis. Who was around at Lennox Lewis? Compare him to who's around now. And it's not just who's around; it's about how it's dissected. Yeah. So would he? How would he have done? And I know it's not fair, but we can dream. How would he have done in Lennox Lewis's era?
Well, let's define the generation of Lennox Lewis. You had Ray Mercer, you had Riddick Bowe, you had Evander Holyfield, and at the end you had Mike Tyson. So these are
but if I would say Evander and Mike Tyson were at the back end of the career. So we probably go a little early in that. Yeah. So then Lennox was fighting, well, the guys he dominated were Galata, Michael Grant, maybe on a lesser level. He was on his downswing when he boxed Klitschko, and that was a very hard fight. Lennox won it on a cut, but he was behind on most of the scorecards. So if you take the Lewis-Klitschko era, if you want to define it like that, and the guys he fought, Oliver McCall, Hasim Rahman, who beat him, and he beat in the return matches. Yeah, I think that Tyson Fury would have beaten the guys that Lennox Lewis beat. Now, Lennox Lewis, Tyson Fury, I'd have to say on accomplishment, Lennox Lewis have beaten better fighters. I mean, he hasn't had his Tysons to fight yet. He hasn't had a Holyfield to define him yet. I mean, Deontay Wilder, I think more people think he was exposed by the losses to Tyson Fury. He had a great knockout run, but I wouldn't put, Deontay Wilder, who will probably wind up in the Hall of Fame based on his overall record, but you can't class him in with a Riddick Bowe or a Holyfield or a Tyson. He'd be better than Michael Grant or Galata. So I would say that I think Lennox Lewis thus far in his accomplishments was a greater fighter than Tyson at this stage of his career. And I don't think Tyson, despite what he said, is finished. But I would Lennox Lewis to beat him. Again, that's the era, the 21st century era, these giants, the Bowes, the Lewises, the Klitschko brothers, now coming with Tyson Fury. Wilder was a tall man, but he wasn't a massive man. But Joshua was a big man. We forget that. So,
Of that time, I think Lewis a better fighter right now than Tyson Fury is. But that's saying a lot because I put Lennox Lewis in our top 10, top 15, top 20 of all time.
Okay, we step a little further back,
Mhm.
and we'd say the Mike Tyson era.
Mhm.
How would you have envisaged Tyson Fury in the Mike Tyson era with that style, with the height, the reach, the movement? You look at the opponents that were around with Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson was a freak of nature in what he achieved as a heavyweight. But then you look at the opponents that were out there. Again, big, small, fast, sure. I think one of and so you got to look. So how would you put him there and then?
Well, Tyson's like an anomaly because he was smaller even than the heavyweight of that era. He was in terms of his size, but he was a tremendous, disproportionately great puncher. He was more in he's like a Marciano or a Dempsey, though. They weren't big, bulky guys. They had the power of a man, 250 pounds. So with a Mike Tyson, again, one of the greatest fighters of all time, we forget how great he was at his peak because what we remember is the end, the Kevin McBride losses and the Francis losses. But when he was dominating, he was knocking out Spinks and Carl Williams and Larry Holmes and Tony Tubbs. Some of these guys had never been knocked out before. And he was really setting the picture until he just burnt out. The fame, the glory, the adulation, you just lose focus. And he lost focus and then had a career, but it was great. Mike Tyson, again, I bring up Wilder because Wilder was like 215 pounds, 220. He was not a massively built man. He was tall, but he wasn't a big 260 pounder. And he, in the first fight, within 1 second more, he'd have knocked out Tyson Fury with a shot. And I think Mike Tyson hit as hard as Deontay Wilder. So I can conceive of Mike Tyson beating Tyson Fury. I think Tyson is great. I don't think he's had that kind of peak where Mike Tyson was like a volcano. I mean, he ran through a situation for about a year or two where he was an invincible fighter. Tyson is winning. I just think Mike Tyson, again, at this stage, I got to see a little bit more of Tyson Fury. I remember Tyson Fury came into the Garden and got knocked down in a fight, got off the deck to beat a cruiserweight. So
Cunningham.
Yes, Cunningham. And, that was shocking. He won the fight. But so he's vulnerable. He can be hit on the chin, as Wilder proved. And if Tyson hits you on the chin, again, these fights could go either way with great fighters. John, anything's possible. But I would put Mike Tyson a notch ahead of him.
We kind of leapfrogged a little era of the Klitschko brothers in their peak. I know Tyson beat Vladimir, but and Vitaly was a completely different beast. Vladimir at an earlier stage in his life when he was at the peak. This is where we're comparing the peak. Versions of these fighters, Vladimir and Vitaly. Again, they had the height, they had that European heavyweight style. Do you and of course you talk about the knockdowns of Tyson Fury. I think he's had to learn on the job and get better on the job and establish himself. Now he's at that stage now where he's proved that in his last 3 or 4 fights. So then comparing him to these two fighters, the Klitschkos that dominated for over 10, 11 years. I mean, in the prime, not the back end of the career. Where would you sit him?
Well, I believe he beats either Klitschko, and I'll tell you why. They had the size, and they had that Europe, the great jab, and ability, the right hand, they had power. But Tyson has that mobility that they didn't have. That's why he beat the other Klitschko brother, Vladimir. I think he had the mobility and the power that they lacked. Again, maybe we have a prejudice as an American. You look at fighters differently because American fighters have a tendency to have more fluidity. Where the Europeans, particularly Eastern Europeans, they have that structure, jab, very robotic, we perceive that as. And I think that Tyson is unique in that. So he has that American style where he has the mobility. I think he would have beat both Klitschkos. I think he's a better fighter than they are.
I get that.
Okay, have the staying power yet, but I think he would have beaten him the way he's fighting right now.
I'd probably agree with you as well. I think that European style will always struggle with an unorthodox fighter. And if you're a fit, confident, unorthodox fighter, forever and a day, you'll ring around a lot of that Eastern European style. We'll go before that. We'll go before Tyson, Mike Tyson. So let's look at an era. Let's look at somebody that really took the headlines. And you'd look at somebody like, we'll go down to the Ali era.
Okay.
Now, this is going to be a little controversial because Tyson Fury, for the height he was at, I think, and the movement he had. And a fully mature Tyson Fury, I think he would have given Ali problems.
I agree with.
Giving him problems. I'm not thinking of beating him. I'm giving him problems.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you. The interesting thing is now we're getting into a different situation. When you go, let's say Ali and pre-Ali, I guess Foreman was the person. These massive heavyweights would really fight and move and punch, unlike a Carnera and a freak show attraction. We're going because the WBC a few years ago started the Bridgerweight division, which is 225 pounds. And now you're really dealing with fighters who are actually Bridgerweight fighters. So there are a division difference. I'll give you an example. There would be more difference in weight between Rocky Marciano and Tyson Fury than there would have been between Rocky Marciano and Jimmy Wild. He's closer in weight, 70 pounds to Wild, than he would be conceding 75 pounds to Tyson Fury. So now you're getting 2 and 3 divisions above. If you looked at them, compared them to everything else. So now this is really not saying who would have won so much, John, in my opinion, but who was the better fighter. Sugar Ray Robinson was a better fighter than Tyson Fury, in my opinion. But Tyson Fury, I think, would have, of course, beaten him just on the size alone. So there's a point where I think just the physics may get in there. So I agree with you. It's going to be almost impossible, Ali, to knock out a Tyson Fury. So he would have to outbox him. And he would have to outbox a man who not only is heavier than him, but has a height and reach and everything else. I agree with you. I think the Usyk fight is probably the pattern to judge that on. Usyk was able to outbox Joshua, bigger, stronger man, but he had such skill. I think Ali had the skill to do it. But again, I think now we're comparing absolutely different divisions with middleweights, with heavyweights, or flyweights with welterweights. Now it's gotten because the size disparity and the weight disparity is so great that you're actually talking about a totally different division in boxing.
Of course, without a doubt, and the likes of Henry Cooper, he was weighing 13 stone 4, 13 stone 8 when he boxed Ali, so he'd be classed as a small cruiserweight. But then the size are different, so it's not just about size. It's talking about movement. You're talking about skill factor. But then can you imagine a Tyson Fury up against somebody like a George Foreman, the George Foreman that knocked out and took out a Joe Frazier, who will come to in a short while.
Yeah.
How would you mix those two?
I like Foreman to beat him as well. Again, here's the thing. We're all ebullient. We're all euphoric about that victory over Dillian White. But he didn't knock out Joe Louis the other night. He didn't knock out Dempsey. He didn't knock out Ali. He knocked out a guy that he was a 5-to-1 on favorite to knock out or to beat. So it's a terrific win. I think the fact that it had 94,000 people and the event was so great maybe enhanced the victory, made it more important to people that they were at this magnificent event. It's a little like Dempsey Carpentier, the first $1 million gate, 80,000 people. But really, Dempsey was going in there as a huge favorite, and he demolished him. It did enhance Dempsey's reputation, like Tyson. But if you take the fights of Tyson Fury, I don't think he's ever had a victory that's comparable to Foreman destroying Joe Frazier, and he did it twice, destroying Ken Norton. The Lyle fights, which were incredible bouts, pretty similar to the Wilder and Fury fights. So at 45, he's a remarkable man.
And George Foreman was classed as a giant back in the day when he boxed your Ali's, boxed your Frazier's. He was a giant. He was a massive unit. That was just. He was heavy. He was tall. He was just basically in your face.
Yeah.
I think he would give a George Foreman trouble because he's elusive enough. He's fast enough. He's tall enough and busy enough. But then again, I think Foreman. On his day, I think Foreman would have caught up to him eventually. But then we mentioned another fight, Joe Frazier. That style for a heavyweight, he was probably a similar style to a Mike Tyson because he was small as a heavyweight, but his pressure was high. He was on the case, and this is probably what Dillian White should have done the other night. As in, never stand off Tyson Fury. Once he started doing that, that was a done deal. The fight was almost done. But then to pressure Tyson Fury, you can't pressure him stood up. You've got to put him under pressure. Bob. It's a work rate that I'm assuming I'd never seen Tyson Dillian White work at, and that would probably give him more success than anything. Yeah. So how would he have gone against a Joe Frazier with the work rate, the pace, that bob and weave style?
Yeah, well, if you look at Ali, the great boxer, he's a little bit. He had been out for 3.5 years, but he did win 2 fights going into that first Frazier bout, beat Quarry and Bonavent. So he did have activity. And Frazier did the style exactly as you said that probably Dillian White should have employed against Tyson the other night. The bob and weave get on. He fought this great boxer, probably the greatest of all time. And he was able to get inside him and work. Frazier would have had to do that against Tyson Fury. It would have been tough
Joe Frazier was a wonderful fighter, tremendous heart, perpetual motion, but he wasn't the most skillful fighter. And he had tremendous height and weight disadvantage against Tyson. He would have to keep inside and just work him and work him and work him. So that's a very interesting fight. Again, I don't want to my age to speak for me, but I think we're talking really the greatest of the greats kind of fighters. Very hard fight to pick. I would again say Frazier only because he was so impressive. He lost only to two Supermen, Foreman and Ali. He did come over here and fight Joe, or come over there, I should say, and fight Joe Bugner. And that was a kind of a tough fight. You know, he went 12 rounds after he fought Ali. It was the first bout he had after he fought Foreman, I'm sorry. And he went 12 rounds, and Bugner was nowhere near as mobile, as heavy a puncher as Tyson Fury. So of all the fighters we just mentioned, I would say he'd probably have the best chance of beating Joe Frazier.
Okay. And I've got to throw this in, probably the final fight before we talk about Dillian White with Tyson and his performance. Jack Johnson.
Wow. Well, Jack Johnson, you know, again, this is a guy, you know, the fighters who dominate, and we go to the heavyweight division just quickly. Jim Jeffries' first really big man. He was 215 pounds, and he shouldn't have fought after 2000. And after 1905, the money was so great, he fought Johnson. He dominated because of his size and bulk. Johnson changed everything around because he had counter punching and clever moves, and he could box and punch. Unlike, he combined the best skills of Jeffries and Corbett and Fitzsimmons in one guy, and he moved boxing ahead. And he had Dempsey and Lewis. They redefined it, and then Ali, of course. So he's so smart. He's like, I'll tell you that, a Tyson Fury fight would, to me, be a little bit similar to Jimmy Young and Foreman. I mean, Tyson Fury is not the slugger, but you're a clever boxer like Usyk. If you are that clever a boxer, you can stand up to anybody. Size and height can be, you know, that you nullify it. And I think Jack Johnson would have the ability to outbox Tyson. Again, a hard fight, because there were nights when Johnson didn't care and didn't fight great. But if you said everything's on the line tonight against Tyson Fury, I think Johnson could have outboxed Tyson. Even the size disadvantage, you can just see a great boxer. If he knows his skill, he would have had the possibility of beating Tyson Fury.
Totally agree with you, Don. You mentioned him a few times, Alexander Usyk. What's your assessment of that fight against Tyson Fury, if it happens?
You know, I got to go with Tyson Fury because he's a guy who can box, maybe not as well as Usyk, but I think he's got such mobility, such physical advantage. It's sort of like a mirror image a little bit to me, but with a bigger guy with more power and probably is faster, which is quite amazing to me. There's pure boxing skill like a Jack Johnson or a Harold Johnson boxing skill Usyk has, but the ability to move around quickly and the ability to be able to knock you out, that's something that Tyson Fury has. And I think Joshua, and you can tell me better, John, you know him better than I do. I don't know him personally. I think he got himself intimidated by Usyk. I think he got himself flustered as the fight got on. You could see the frustration. That I don't think can happen with the mindset of a guy like Fury, particularly after coming about this win. And people are saying, you're the greatest of all time. He's saying he's the greatest of all time. I think he's the guy that the ego is so massive that I don't think he let himself be intimidated or get flustered. You know, he'll find a way to pull it out.
I'd have to agree with you totally on every level of that. So Don, just a quick one. Let me just touch on Dempsey. Let me just touch on Marciano. Now Tyson Fury, his mind games are the best. The best I've seen. Yeah. Now these two guys had an absolutely iron will, and usually a fighter has lost a fight before a fight because of being intimidated or being conned and hustled out of the game, and they turn their game plan into anger. Yeah. Tyson Fury is excellent at playing all those games. How do you think Dempsey and Marciano would have handled that kind of psyche, that kind of mentality from Tyson Fury, remembering? And we've seen it in history when Tyson Fury boxed Klitschko, and I was there. Klitschko, he underestimated him. He took him for a clown. He took him for a fool when he was singing in the build-up, and he just dismissed him and say, "What is this man going to do to me?" So would Dempsey, would Marciano have that same opinion? How would they handle this?
Well, you know, it's pretty much like you said, but when Sonny Liston did the same thing with Ali, if you recall, dismissed him as everybody did, and then he got a shock of his life. But I think the guys like Dempsey and Marciano, they're so unique. They're so primal. You know, I don't know what could intimidate those guys. I mean, Dempsey was outboxed at the end of his career by Gene Tunney. Again, it moved into a different era of fighting. Tunney was trained differently, but Dempsey had gone. The Dempsey after about 1925 was a different guy. He was a multi-millionaire. The hungry Dempsey who came in with Willard could have beaten anybody ever lived. And the same with a Marciano. You could shoot Marciano. We would get up off the floor and keep coming. You know, he had his nose split open with Ezra Charles. I mean, Ezra Charles is among the greatest boxers that ever lived. Archie Moore is one of the most intelligent fighters who ever lived. And he, you know, he came off the deck to knock out Archie Moore. He came back from a split nose in half to knock out Ezra Charles. Dempsey beat a giant in Willard, and I mean a giant for that day. He also fought another huge guy, Fred Fulton, who was 6'5", and knocked him out in 18 seconds of the first round. That's the fight that established him. I don't think these guys was possible to intimidate them. On the size alone, again, you've got to give Tyson Fury a shot, because it was 60, 70 pounds difference in the weight. But in terms of their raw ability, I think they were both better fighters than Tyson Fury. I mean, they had that power, they could land, and again, if you just go by size and you just go by the height and weight and reach, Tyson Fury's got an incredible advantage there. But these two guys, they're impossible to intimidate. I couldn't, inconceivable they could be intimidated. I think they both would have had a chance to get inside Tyson, and they would never stop. They would have done what Dillian White was supposed to do the other night. Believe me, they would never take a backward step. If he knocked them out, maybe, but they would keep coming until the night went dark, or they went dark.
And you know what, you're talking about the history makers of our game as well. You mentioned so many iconic names, and these are the guys that set the stall out for young men like Tyson Fury, that young men like even Ali, even young men like Dillian White coming through. Mm-hmm. You looked at these guys and you took what worked and what didn't work. You looked at the mentality, you looked at the style. You pick one style or another. You're either a fighter or you're a boxer. Tyson Fury just has the ability to do them all for such a big guy. But he'd have been a better boxer rather than a fighter against your Dempseys, against your Marcianos. But again, I suppose it's unfair, but we can always play with history.
Yeah, it's an argument that will never be won, but can never be lost.
Dillian White, was he just outclassed, or did he choose the wrong tactics, or he was just not in the races against Fury?
I think it's a combination of everything you said. You know, I don't know. He didn't seem to be changing. I saw when he was mixing it up and he was trying, but I just didn't seem enough fire underneath him. I just don't know what. You've got to, like you say, you're not winning. Try to change tactics, and maybe he just couldn't do that. You know, I don't know. Look, I didn't think he had the, he didn't have the engine to beat this guy going in. But you meet the challenge, and he, as you say, he should have been more like a Frazier, more like a keep going in, say go for broke. He ended up getting knocked out at the end. But I just don't think he had enough firepower. He just didn't have enough, maybe ability overall. But and to change the tactics, to press the fight more, to bob and weave, get under the jab of Tyson Fury, he just wasn't doing that. Wasn't effective enough.
Don, the thing is, Dillian White had probably been training for 2 years for that fight, because he based himself out in Portugal, which I respect massively. Mm-hmm. He turned his whole life and said that all I'm going to do is train. That's all he did. So when it comes to conditioning, I believe he had the conditioning. Mm-hmm. What I also believe, I don't know if it's true or not. I also believe that I think Dillian's tactics for the fight were all wrong. Was he capable of doing it? Did Tyson Fury let him do it? I don't think he did. I think Tyson Fury tied him up when he needed to tie him up, lent on him, fought rough and awkward after when he had to. But you've got to look at the knockout itself. And the knockout isn't one of those shots where a fighter will instinctively throw a shot because it's a reaction. Mm-hmm. The knockout was actually set up.
Yes,
it was calculated. It was premeditated. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the shot from behind, when Tyson threw a shot, he threw a classic left right uppercut. He twisted the hip into it, pushed the back foot out from it, and landed it, skimmed it, spun the brain, and then boom, push him off for distance. And so to me, that was to do that with such a big unit like Dillian White. You meet him up close and personal. This he's like a bull. But to me, when I saw that, I actually thought it was when he beat Deontay Wilder, but you've got to give credit where credit's due. I thought, you know what, Tyson Fury, I've got to give you maximum respect, because you have now, as far as I'm concerned, established yourself currently the best heavyweight in the world.
Yeah. I'll tell you, the guy suffers here is poor Anthony. Well, he's not poor, but Anthony Joshua. Where is he even spoken of? He's got to do something. he, as I said, I didn't think he could retire without this Usyk, but he's got to do something, make a statement, knock out Usyk, because he's been the forgotten man. This is the hero, and he was the mega hero. Tyson Fury was secondary, maybe tertiary to him. And boy, he really has the chance now to reestablish himself for his legacy.
Yeah, but when you've had 90 to 94,000 people in Wembley, you've got to have a little bit of an ego. So I'm quite sure Anthony Joshua's ego is thinking, and I want a piece of this. And let's not say it's not an impossible ask for him to beat Usyk. It's a tough ask, a tougher ask than beating Usyk than it was Ruiz. It's not an impossible task to beat Usyk. And then that's when this fight comes. But in reality, and these guys, Joshua, my friend, but I just think he's the one that he's got the work to do. He's got to do it. It's not about who you like more. It's about who the better fighter is. And to me, he's got to prove. Tyson Fury's proved everything. He's got to prove he's the better man. So you've got to lean towards Tyson Fury. You've got to think, Tyson Fury is the one that's got everything in place.
Oh, yes.
And it's up to Anthony Joshua to prove, I deserve to get in this mix. I deserve this adulation, what this man is now getting. And it's great, especially here in the UK, to have two British heavyweights in such a position.
Unbelievable. I mean, you are where we were 50 years ago with Ali Frazier. It's just phenomenal. And imagine the crowd. But yeah, Joshua, boy, he needs to make a statement with Usyk. And if he can knock out Usyk, I think everybody forgets that. And then the battle comes, the argument with everyone, who's going to win, Joshua and Tyson Fury. But if you want the measure of a man, boy, is there a burden on the shoulders of Joshua. His legacy's got to beat Usyk, and he's got to come back and fight Tyson. Whatever comes there, I don't know. But I think that Joshua does beat Usyk in the rematch. I really believe that. I think it's just so important. It's like with Frazier, his whole life was beating Ali, and he did it. He was done after that. He's got to beat Usyk to get this Tyson Fury fight. Whatever happens there is an extra boost or a detraction, but he needs that fight in his career, the win over Usyk and the fight with Tyson Fury, regardless of outcome, for cementing him. It's just, he needs that. It's something that his career would be without an end. Just be forgotten, I think, if he doesn't have that fight.
Don, chilling and potentially very exciting. I'm looking forward to see how it all turns out in the wash. Thank you very, very much again for your amazing insight.
Thank you, John. It's always a privilege.